A secluded house on the outskirts of Havenwood, Georgia. During the day, the atmosphere here seems calm, but this silence is deceptive. Nestled among tall trees, the house resembles a hideaway, tucked away from the outside world. But for Emery LaSalle, this house had long ceased to be a refuge. It had become a cage. Emery stands in the kitchen, listening to the hum of emptiness around him. The house is engulfed in an uneasy silence, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The kitchen is bathed in a cold light filtering through the curtains. Emery starts noticing small details, the droplets of water on the sink, a slightly moved chair at the table, that stir up a sense of anxiety within him, one he has been battling for months. Seemingly insignificant things suddenly take on a disturbing significance. In recent weeks, Emery has found himself questioning why his senses are so heightened. He feels the air in the house growing heavy, filled with an anxiety he can't quite explain. Everything seems normal, but that's what unsettles him the most. It's too quiet, he thinks, staring into space. Something's not right here. Back in the summer, he and Jackson Whitfield installed cameras around the perimeter of the house. At the time, it seemed like a good idea, to create an illusion of control and security. Jackson had said it would help them sleep better, but since then, Emery often catches himself thinking that these cameras make him even more anxious. It's as if they're watching him, recording his every move. Sometimes, when he walks to the window and looks at the front door, he gets the eerie feeling that someone behind the camera is watching him too. He recalls a recent incident when he found one of the cameras inside the house, even though they had agreed they would all stay outside. Jackson brushed it off as a simple mistake, but Emery felt that there was something hidden beneath this mistake. From the beginning, something about Jackson's behavior seemed off, but Emery chose to ignore it. However, now, in this oppressive silence, the oddities become clear. Over the past few weeks, Emery has repeatedly noticed things in the house moving as if someone was invading his personal space. One morning, his favorite book was on the couch, though he distinctly remembered leaving it on his bedside table. Another time, his car keys mysteriously ended up in the bathroom, even though he usually kept them on the entryway table. Jackson always brushes it off, claiming that Emery is simply forgetful, but Emery knows that's not true. Things get even more unsettling at night. Every time Emery falls asleep, something wakes him, a creak of the floorboards or a faint noise resembling footsteps. In the darkness, shadows seem to move, and he often catches himself thinking that there's someone else in the house. Every night, Emery gets up, walks to the hallway, and checks if the front door is locked, even though he knows he locked it before bed. Yet, the sense of security that the door was supposed to provide has long since evaporated. When Jackson moved in 2 years ago, Emery was happy to share the house with a new family member. But soon, tension developed between them. Emery, who grew up alone and felt constant emotional neglect from his parents, had always sought support and understanding. But even when Jackson was around, Emery felt a strange, oppressive sensation, as if someone was constantly assessing and studying him. Jackson seemed to know everything about Emery's childhood, even those moments he preferred to keep to himself. Over time, it started to seem like Jackson was deliberately using this knowledge to infiltrate Emery's thoughts and control him. Now, standing in the kitchen and looking at the slightly ajar door to the hallway, Emery recalls how he once found a note in his room that read, "You are not alone." At the time, he dismissed it as a silly joke. But now, looking back over the past few months, he begins to realize that it may have been a warning. He also remembers a recent incident when his phone suddenly lost signal, only to show a call from an unknown number. On the other end, there was silence, followed by a barely audible whisper, "He's watching you." Emery hung up and felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. On that Tuesday afternoon, as the house once again sank into its usual silence, Emery felt a growing sense of unease inside him. He couldn't explain where this feeling was coming from, but he instinctively knew that something ominous and unpredictable lay ahead. With each passing day, the walls of this house seemed to close in, and the surveillance cameras became eyes watching his every step. Emery LaSalle increasingly feels reality distorting around him. Over the past few weeks, His confidence in his own memories and perceptions has been unraveling. It seems like everything around him is subject to doubt. Jackson Whitfield, his stepbrother, appears friendly and caring on the surface, but his behavior is growing ever more sinister. It all started with small details. Emery remembers one day in early September when he returned home to find his laptop in a different spot from where he left it that morning. He asked Jackson if he had touched his things, but received only a calm and assured reply, "You probably forgot where you put it." The same thing happened with the TV remote, then a book. Each time, Jackson denied involvement, adding, "You need to be more mindful of your things, Emery. You're becoming so scatterbrained." As time passed, the situation escalated. Jackson not only denied his involvement, but he began altering the details of their conversations. For example, one evening in early October, when Emery mentioned that Jackson had promised to help him with car repairs, Jackson looked at him in surprise and confidently stated, "You never asked me about that. Maybe you dreamt it?" Emery felt reality slipping away. At first, he was sure of his memories, but after several similar incidents, he began to doubt himself. He felt like he was losing control of his own mind. By mid-October, the disappearance of items became a regular occurrence. His car keys, wallet, and headphones would suddenly go missing, only to turn up in the most unexpected places. One morning, Emery woke up to find his phone missing. In a panic, he searched the room but found nothing. When he finally decided to ask Jackson, he calmly opened a drawer in the kitchen and pulled out the phone, saying, "You probably left it here last night. You forget things so often." This incident shook Emery. He distinctly remembered placing the phone on his bedside table before sleeping, but Jackson was so convincing that Emery started doubting his memory. The messages started appearing soon after this incident. The first came on a Friday night, October 11th. A text flashed on Emery's phone screen, "You belong to me." The sender's number was unknown. Emery froze, feeling a chill run down his spine. He tried to calm himself, dismissing it as a random mistake or some stupid prank, but the messages continued. A few days later, he received another, "He's watching you." This time, the text appeared on a piece of paper that Emery found in his backpack. He was certain he hadn't put any notes there. Jackson seemed to notice Emery's anxiety and began exploiting it. He took on the role of the only source of safety in Emery's life, comforting him when he spoke about the disturbing messages. "You're overreacting, Emery," he would say in a soft tone. "You know I'm here to protect you." Over time, Emery increasingly relied on Jackson as the only thing preventing him from spiraling into chaos. The evening drags on slowly. Emery is in the kitchen, cooking dinner, when he hears Jackson enter the house. His steps sound confident, measured, as if he knows exactly where he is headed. Emery feels the air growing tense. He hears Jackson approaching, his presence pressing down, filling the space. When Jackson steps into the kitchen, a faint smile forms on his face, but there's something cold and calculating in his eyes. He moves toward Emery with a slow confidence, like a predator approaching its prey. "Cooking something good?" His voice sounds casual, but Emery senses an unspoken threat beneath it. Emery tries to keep control of himself, but feels his thoughts start to blur. Jackson stands too close, invading his personal space, making him feel vulnerable. "You look worried," Jackson says, staring at him intently. "Something happened?" The question seems caring, but Jackson's tone hints at something else, as if he already knows the answer, as if he is certain that he has trapped Emery. Emery feels reality slipping away from him. It's as if Jackson is reading his mind, seeing his fears and using them against him. "No, everything's fine," Emery replies, trying to sound calm, but his voice trembles. He turns away, pretending to be absorbed in cooking, but he can feel Jackson's gaze piercing through him. Jackson moves closer, and Emery freezes, feeling the warmth of Jackson's body behind him. "You know," Jackson says slowly, almost in a whisper, "I've noticed you've been really anxious lately, like something's bothering you." His words dig into Emery's consciousness, making him wonder how much Jackson knows. "I just feel like sometimes something's happening here," Emery begins uncertainly, but Jackson interrupts, smiling. "Something happening? Maybe you're imagining things again?" He drags out the pause, then adds, I think you're confusing reality with your fears. I'm always here, remember? I know what's going on. Jackson leans in and almost whispers in his ear. You can trust me. Always. Emery feels a wave of horror wash over him. Jackson knows too much. He hints at thoughts and fears that Emery had never voiced. What do you mean? Emery blurts out, his voice shaking. Jackson steps back, seemingly savoring the reaction, and smiles. I just know that you need to trust someone who's close. Someone who really understands you. This conversation becomes the point where Emery begins to realize he is under someone's control. Every word from Jackson feels like a web tightening around him, stripping him of the ability to think clearly. Night has fallen, casting the house in Havenwood into silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves outside. An air of tension lingers, laden with the unspoken words of their recent conversations. Jackson enters the living room, where Emery sits nervously on the edge of the couch. The dim lighting creates an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Emery feels a lump rise in his throat as Jackson draws closer, his footsteps sounding like he's confident in every move he makes. Jackson stops in front of Emery and extends a hand, gently placing it on his shoulder. You know I'm always here to protect you, he says, his voice calm but carrying a hidden threat. Emery feels his heart racing faster, his palms growing clammy from the tension. Jackson leans in, resting one hand on the back of the couch, his face mere inches away from Emery's. He doesn't break eye contact. His gaze penetrates deep. Emery doesn't move, paralyzed. Jackson gives a slight smile and whispers softly, You know this is inevitable, right? Before Emery can process what's happening, Jackson leans in and kisses him. At that moment, all of Emery's senses sharpen. This is not just a kiss, it's a claim. Jackson's lips move softly yet firmly, establishing his right to a territory he has long occupied in Emery's mind. At the same time, Jackson wraps his arms around Emery's neck, pulling him closer, almost painfully so. In this suffocating closeness, he whispers in Emery's ear, Now you're mine. There's no turning back. The words ripple through Emery's body like a wave of horror, seeping into his consciousness like poison. Jackson kisses him again, but this time the kiss is searingly long, filled with an overwhelming sense of control. Emery closes his eyes, unable to resist. His body is tense and yet motionless. When Jackson finally releases him, Emery remains still, almost petrified. A shiver runs through his body. Jackson slowly steps back, casting one last look at him before turning and leaving the room, leaving Emery alone. The room feels enclosed, the walls closing in. Emery rises slowly and heads toward his bedroom, feeling the horror grow with every step down the hallway. Entering his room, he stops. There's something under the door. He bends down and picks up a thin sheet of paper. It's a photograph. His heart starts to race. The photograph shows him and Jackson, an image taken somewhere in the past, but their faces are ominously crossed out with a black pen, leaving only dark silhouettes. Emery clutches the photograph in his hands, feeling the fear overwhelm him. He frantically tries to recall if anyone had seen this photograph before. Who took it? Who put it under the door? There are no answers. The room starts to spin before his eyes, and he feels the suffocating sensation that he is constantly being watched. From that moment on, Emery's life turns into a living nightmare. Every night he wakes up with the haunting feeling that someone is in his room. He begins to hear faint rustling noises at night, barely perceptible footsteps outside his bedroom door. Soon, he notices things in the room changing places. His jacket suddenly ends up on the chair, even though he distinctly remembers hanging it in the closet. One night, he wakes up at 3 o'clock, and his bedside lamp is on, though he is certain he turned it off before bed. Missed calls from unknown numbers start appearing on his phone. One evening, he notices unread messages in his inbox that he doesn't remember receiving or opening. They are short, simple phrases, but they cut deep into his mind. He's near. You can't escape. Emery doesn't know who sent them, but each message only adds to his growing paranoia. He begins to feel like a prisoner in his own home. Every morning, he checks his room for signs of someone else's presence. One day, he notices that his window is slightly open. He is certain he closed it the night before. A terrifying thought crosses his mind. Someone has been entering his room while he sleeps. A few days after the incident with the photograph, he receives his first call from a distorted voice. It happens in the evening, when he's sitting in his room, trying to focus on a book to distract himself from what's going on. The phone rings, an unknown number. Emery answers, his hands slightly trembling. "Hello?" he says uncertainly. On the other end, there is silence, then a low, distorted voice. He's not who he says he is. Emery freezes, his body tense like a tightly wound string. "Who is this?" he whispers, feeling the fear spread inside him. But there is only silence again, followed by the sound of the line disconnecting. He looks at the phone, at the screen displaying the unknown number, and feels a chill run down his spine. From that moment, the calls become regular. Sometimes they come at night, sometimes during the day. On the other end is always the same distorted voice, uttering phrases that throw Emery off balance. "You need to run. Don't trust him. He doesn't know what to do, can't share this information with anyone." With each call, his doubts intensify. Now he's no longer sure who the real enemy is, Jackson or this unseen watcher invading his life and shattering the remnants of his reality. Emery LaSalle sits in the kitchen, watching as Jackson Whitfield hurriedly leaves the house. This is his chance. He knows Jackson is gone, and he has an opportunity to find out what's behind Jackson's mysterious behavior. Gathering his courage, Emery decides to enter Jackson's room, which had always been off-limits. The door is locked, and even the slightest curiosity was always met with Jackson's icy glare. But today, the key to the room hangs on the hook by the front door. It's strange, but Emery can't let this opportunity slip by. Emery enters the room, and the first thing that strikes him is the cleanliness and order, unnaturally so. He starts searching. His heart is pounding so hard that he's afraid it might give away his location if Jackson suddenly returns. He checks the shelves, drawers, and closet. Nothing stands out until he comes across a cabinet by the wall, inside which he finds a hidden compartment. Opening it, Emery freezes. In front of him lies Jackson's dark archive, photographs, journals, items that Emery had long considered lost. On top of the stack are photographs taken at various times, all featuring Emery. Some photos were clearly taken in secret, while he was sleeping in the bathroom through a crack in the door, outside the house. In some of the photos, Jackson stands next to him, but his expression is strange, cold, as if he's looking at an object of study rather than a person. Emery, his hands trembling, flips through the journals. Inside are entries dated over several months. Jackson meticulously describes Emery's behavior. October 12th. Emery seemed confused again. Said he thought he saw something. He needs more control. These entries read like a scientist's observations of a test subject. The words, cold and detached, reinforced the sense that Jackson sees Emery as his possession. At the bottom of the compartment, Emery finds a small box containing his personal belongings. A watch he lost a month ago, a pin engraved with his initials, and, the most shocking, a fragment of his torn shirt, which he threw out back in August. All this time, Jackson not only watched him but also took pieces of his life, turning them into trophies of his control. Emery notices a flash drive lying beneath the journals. He grabs it and plugs it into Jackson's laptop. Opening the files, he finds dozens of audio recordings. Playing one of them, he hears his own voice. It's a recording of a private conversation he had with himself in his bedroom. That night he talked about his fears. It hits him then. Jackson had been bugging his room. Shock overwhelms him, along with the realization of just how far Jackson has gone to exert his control. The sound of footsteps brings Emery back to reality. Jackson is returning. Emery quickly puts everything back in place, closes the compartment, and slips out of the room. But his pale, frightened face betrays him. Jackson notices as soon as he steps through the door. "Are you all right?" he asks, staring intently at Emery. Emery decides it's now or never. "I know you've been watching me," he says, his voice trembling. Jackson, instead of being caught off guard, calmly smiles and replies, "What are you talking about?" Emery tells him about the journals and the surveillance, but Jackson merely shakes his head. "You're losing touch with reality," Emery. You know things sometimes just seem different to you. Jackson's calmness and confidence throw Emery off balance. Doubt begins to creep in. Did he really see everything? Or is it the result of his exhausting fear? Jackson uses this moment, steps closer, and quietly says, "You need to rest. Your mind has started playing tricks on you." At that moment, Emery realizes that Jackson is reclaiming control over his mind. Weeks pass, and the tension only intensifies. Emery no longer feels safe even in his own room. Every little thing seems like a signal of danger. He decides to flee, planning his escape in secret so Jackson won't find out. In the evening, he gathers his belongings and hides them under the bed, intending to leave at night when Jackson is asleep. Midnight arrives. Emery quietly rises and heads for the door. He's almost made it to the exit when suddenly the hallway light turns on. "Where are you going?" Jackson's voice rings out, calm yet firm. Emery freezes and turns around. Jackson stands in the doorway, arms crossed, his gaze stern and piercing. "You really thought I didn't know?" Jackson says mockingly, stepping forward. "I know every move you make, Emery. You never had a chance to leave." With those words, he extends his hand and pulls out a small voice recorder from his pocket. "You forget, I'm not the only one watching you," he adds, his voice turning serious and threatening. Emery looks at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asks, feeling terror wash over him once again. Jackson smirks and leans in closer. "I have a partner. Someone you trust." The phrase cuts through Emery's mind like a knife. Who could it be? A friend? A neighbor? He starts to suspect everyone around him. From this moment on, Jackson changes his tactics. He alternates between being caring and harsh, mixing moments of closeness with threats. He touches Emery's shoulder and says, "I'm protecting you from dangers you can't even comprehend." But when Emery asks what those dangers are, Jackson answers cryptically, further confusing him and pushing him into a state of panic. Now, Emery lives in constant fear. He doesn't know who threatens him more, Jackson or this unseen third party he keeps talking about. Every time Jackson approaches, he feels a coldness spreading through his body. Jackson knows his weaknesses and manipulates them, keeping him under his control. Emery stands in the kitchen, staring tensely at his reflection in the dark glass door of the oven. A small voice recorder lies on the table in front of him. This is his last chance. He has set a trap for Jackson, pretending to submit to his control, to be just a victim again. He hears Jackson's footsteps in the hallway and freezes, pretending to be busy with dinner. Anxiety gnaws at him, but he forces himself to maintain a calm expression. Jackson enters the kitchen, scanning the room as if checking that everything is in its place. He stops, staring at Emery, his face showing satisfaction. "I see you've finally calmed down," he says, his voice filled with false concern but with an undertone of superiority. Emery turns to him and forces a smile. "Yeah, you were right. I needed to accept everything as it is," he replies with a hint of submission, trying to convince Jackson that he's back in control. Jackson steps closer, and at that moment, Emery realizes it's time to move forward with his plan. "But you know," Emery continues, looking Jackson directly in the eyes, "I've learned a lot about you lately." Jackson narrows his eyes slightly, his smile turning tense. "What are you talking about?" he asks cautiously. Emery decides to take the first step toward revealing the truth. "I know about what happened last year in Atlanta. About that story you tried to hide." Jackson recoils slightly, his eyes flare up. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he says coldly, but Emery notices a tremor in his voice. Emery presses on, "You think you can control everything. But I found out that the police investigated a disappearance case, and you somehow ended up among the suspects." That was the moment Jackson lost it. His face twists with rage. "You know nothing," he shouts, his voice shaking with fury. "You are nothing but my project. You belong to me. I made you who you are." Jackson suddenly grabs Emery's arm and pulls him close. "You have no idea how weak and helpless you are without me." His words sound like a confession of deep obsession and an intense need for total control. At that moment, Emery feels a mixture of horror and determination rising within him. He knew this moment would come. And that's exactly why he has a voice recorder running in his jeans pocket, recording everything. Now he has proof of Jackson's obsession, the only thing that might give him a chance to escape this prison. Jackson, oblivious to the recorder, continues his tirade. But Emery, realizing he now has evidence, decides it's time to end this act. He pulls away from Jackson and says, "It's all recorded. I have proof of your control and manipulation." For a moment, surprise flashes across Jackson's face, then it turns into a cruel smile. "You think that changes anything?" Jackson slowly steps closer, his eyes burning with anger and determination. "Do you really think anyone will believe you? I know all your secrets, Emery, and if you try anything, I'll expose them to the world." Jackson threatens, leaving Emery in a moral and psychological dilemma. He realizes he's trapped. He has evidence, but Jackson holds cards that could destroy him. In the days that follow, the tension reaches its peak. Jackson grows more domineering, his confidence in his power over Emery solidifying. He now sets conditions directly. One evening, on December 24th, Jackson sits across from Emery at the kitchen table, leaning on it. His face displays cold determination. "You have a choice," he begins, his voice calm but even more terrifying because of it. "You can stay with me and live under my control, or I'll reveal all your secrets and ruin your life." His words sound like a sentence. "You know I can do it. You have no idea how deeply I've infiltrated your life." Emery lowers his head, feeling a wave of helplessness wash over him. Jackson has trapped him, stripping him of the chance to resist. Jackson takes his time, allowing Emery to sink into his thoughts, savoring the moment. Emery doesn't respond. His mind is swirling with chaotic thoughts. He sees no way out. It feels like any attempt to resist will lead to disaster. He looks at his phone lying on the table in front of him. The screen lights up, and a new message from an unknown number appears. "You can't win." Emery flinches, staring at the words. He doesn't know who sent it, Jackson's partner, or someone else watching them. At that moment, slow footsteps echo through the house. Jackson stands up, his silhouette blocking the light in the room, leaving Emery in the shadows. This moment epitomizes the uncertainty of his situation. Emery sits in the kitchen, alone, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen connected to the surveillance cameras. The footage on the screen flickers from time to time, creating the feeling that someone might still be controlling them. Since the last confrontation, the atmosphere in the house hasn't changed. Emery lives in a fog, constantly feeling watched. The cameras, installed by Jackson, are everywhere. In the hallway, at the front door, even in his bedroom. Every time he looks at the screen, he feels a chill run through his body. Someone is watching him, and now it's not just a suspicion. It's a fact he has to live with. Emery's phone vibrates. He slowly picks it up, seeing a message on the screen. "I've been watching both of you." The phrase confuses him. Who sent this message? Jackson's partner, or someone else entirely? Someone he doesn't know yet? Emery sits in a daze, his heart tightening with anxiety. He realizes that the threat hasn't disappeared. His story is far from over, and he's once again left alone with this grim sense of uncertainty. The story ends with Emery sitting in the kitchen in complete silence. Outside, the wind rustles the leaves, and the house is filled with an oppressive stillness. Footsteps echo outside the door, making him freeze. He doesn't know what will happen next, but he knows one thing. Control over his life has never returned to him.